Now, let's take a look at when do we need to advocate and when to persuade. There are many injustices in the world, and there are plenty of local and global causes about which we can advocate and persuade others to care and to act. Just as persuasion involves changing someone's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, the topics about which we persuade and advocate fall into one of three categories: questions of fact, value, or policy. While we might try to make arguments about all three of these areas over the course of an entire presentation or document, each argument that we make will most closely resemble one of these three questions. Now let's take a look at them. To start, let's take a look at question of fact. Now, when we are persuading others about a question of fact, we are trying to change their beliefs about something. We might be trying to convince others that something does or does not exist, is or is not real, and is or is not related to other issues. For example, if you are trying to persuade your audience that climate change is actually happening, that marine mammals are being harmed by plastic in the oceans, or that food deserts are a cause of poor health outcomes, you are making an argument about a question of fact. For each of these types of arguments, you will need to use evidence to help your audience understand that a phenomenon exists, to help establish that the phenomenon has a meaningful impact, and to make casual claims about why it exists. Now, let's take a look at questions of value. When we are persuading others about a question of value, we are trying to change their attitudes about something. In this type of argument, we are trying to persuade our audience about how they emotionally respond to something, how important they believe something is, or about the ethical or moral obligations that they have on a particular issue. For example, you might argue that climate change is one of the most important issues facing the world in the upcoming decade, or that we should feel bad that ocean mammals are being harmed by discarded trash. You might also argue that we have a moral obligation to ensure that everyone has access to fresh food in their communities. Now, in each of these situations, you are trying to either change someone's attitudes or to increase the strength of attitudes that they might already hold. Now, let's take a look at questions of policy. When we are persuading others about a question of policy, we are trying to change their actions. This might involve actually changing how individual people behave, or it might involve trying to change a policy for what entire groups of people, organizations, communities, or governments do. For example, for climate change, you might try to convince your audience to take public transportation or to bike to work more often. Or you might try to convince your audience to write letters of support to convince policymakers to establish more strict emissions control. And for marine wildlife, you might persuade your audience to volunteer for a local rescue organization, to not buy products with the types of plastic packaging that often makes their way into oceans, or just try to donate money to an organization. For food deserts, you might argue for the establishment of community food cooperatives in areas where it is more difficult for grocery stores to succeed, or might argue that your audience should support local farm markets and local grocers so that they are profitable and can remain open. In each of these situations, you are making an argument about some type of action that should be taken, whether by an individual, a group, or a policy making body.